The dust swirled across the barren street of Promise Creek as a lone figure stood facing a growing mob, her auburn hair whipping wildly in the wind while tears streamed down her dirt-smudged face. Abigail Turner hadn't expected her return to this dusty Montana town in 1875 would be met with such hostility, but then again, she never expected to return at all after what happened 5 years ago. "Witch!" screamed a woman from the crowd as she bent down to collect a jagged stone from the ground. Abigail flinched, backing away as the first stone sailed past her shoulder. "Please," she called out, her voice trembling. "I only came back to see my father. Your father's dead because of you," bellowed a man in the front of the crowd, his face contorted with rage as he encouraged others to join in the growing hostility. Another stone flew, striking Abigail's arm. She cried out in pain, clutching the spot that would surely bruise. The crowd was closing in now, their faces twisted with a hatred born of superstition and fear. They had always been suspicious of her remedies, her knowledge of herbs and healing that she'd learned from her Cherokee grandmother. But after the fever had swept through town 5 years ago, claiming so many lives despite her desperate attempts to help, they had branded her a witch, driving her away with threats and fire. The sound of hoofbeats cut through the commotion as a tall, broad-shouldered man on a chestnut stallion rode into the scene. Owen Burke pulled his horse to a stop between Abigail and the mob. Dust billowed around him as he dismounted in one fluid motion, his spurs jingling as his boots hit the ground. His face was partially obscured by the shadow cast by his wide-brimmed hat, but there was no mistaking the hard set of his jaw or the determination in his stance. Another stone was thrown, and Owen stepped directly in front of Abigail, shielding her with his body. The rock struck him squarely in the shoulder, but he didn't flinch. "She's mine," he declared, his deep voice carrying across the stunned silence that followed. His hand rested casually on the handle of his revolver, though he made no move to draw it. "Anyone who has a problem with her has a problem with me." Abigail stared at the back of the stranger's head in disbelief. She had never seen this man before in her life, yet here he was, claiming her as his own and facing down an entire mob on her behalf. The crowd murmured uncertainly, the collective courage faltering in the face of the imposing cowboy. Owen Burke had a reputation that stretched across 3 territories, a former Texas Ranger turned bounty hunter, whose name alone was enough to make most men think twice before crossing him. "Burke," acknowledged Samuel Jenkins, the shopkeeper who had been leading the mob, "this ain't your business." "This woman brought death to our town. Seems to me that fevers bring death," Owen replied evenly, "and throwing stones at a woman doesn't bring anyone back to life." He turned slightly, keeping his eyes on the crowd while addressing Abigail. "Get on my horse, madam." Abigail hesitated only briefly before gathering her tattered skirts and climbing onto the saddle with practiced ease. Owen backed up slowly, never turning his back on the crowd, before swinging up behind her in one smooth motion. "This town's been through enough," he said to the gathered faces. "Go home to your families. There's been enough pain here without adding more." With that, he nudged his horse forward, one arm securely around Abigail's waist as they rode away from Promise Creek, leaving behind a cloud of dust and a crowd of confused, angry townspeople. They rode in silence for nearly an hour, following the winding trail that led into the rolling foothills. Abigail was acutely aware of the stranger's arm around her waist, strong and steady. She could feel the rise and fall of his chest against her back with each breath he took. "Why did you do that?" she finally asked, her voice barely audible above the rhythmic hoofbeats. Owen didn't immediately answer. When he did, His voice was as rough as the terrain they traversed. "No decent man stands by while a mob attacks a woman." "You don't know me," Abigail countered. "You don't know what they say I did." "I know enough," he replied. "I've been tracking a man for 3 weeks. Passed through Promise Creek last month and heard talk about the witch who'd been run out of town years back. Folks there are quick to blame what they don't understand." Abigail fell silent, processing his words. "Where are you taking me?" "I've got a cabin about 10 miles from here. You'll be safe there while I finish my business." "And then what?" she pressed. Owen's pause was telling. "That's up to you, madam. But I reckon going back to Promise Creek isn't the best idea." The sun was beginning to set when they reached a small, sturdy cabin nestled against the backdrop of pine-covered mountains. A creek bubbled nearby, and a corral stood empty beside a modest barn. It was simple but well-maintained, a sanctuary in the wilderness. Owen helped Abigail dismount, his hands strong at her waist. For the first time, she got a clear look at the man who had declared her his to an angry mob. He was older than she'd initially thought, perhaps in his early 30s, with keen blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. A scar ran along his jawline, disappearing into the light stubble that covered his face. There was a weariness about him, the kind that came from years of hard living and harder choices. "It's not much," he said, gesturing toward the cabin, "but it's dry and warm." Abigail nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by the events of the day. Her legs trembled beneath her and she swayed slightly on her feet. Owen's hand shot out to steady her. "When's the last time you ate?" she tried to remember. "Yesterday morning, I think." His expression hardened. Without a word, he led her to the cabin and helped her inside. The interior was sparse but clean: a table with 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, a bed in the corner covered with a patchwork quilt, and shelves lined with supplies. "Sit," he instructed, guiding her to a chair. "I'll get a fire going and fix something to eat." Abigail watched as Owen moved efficiently around the small space, striking a fire in the hearth and pulling supplies from his shelves. There was something fascinating about watching this large, dangerous-looking man perform such domestic tasks with practiced ease. "You live alone?" she asked, trying to make sense of this strange turn of events. "Yes," he replied without elaboration. "How long have you been bounty hunting?" He paused in his work, a flicker of surprise crossing his features. "How'd you know that's what I do?" "The wanted posters in your saddlebag," she explained. "I saw them when I mounted your horse." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Observant, 8 years give or take. And before that, Texas Ranger." He returned to his task, slicing salt pork into a pan to sizzle over the fire. 5 years of that was enough. As Owen prepared a simple meal of beans, salt pork, and biscuits, Abigail found herself studying him more closely. Despite his gruff exterior, there was a gentleness to his movements, a consideration in how he placed a cup of water before her without being asked. They ate in companionable silence, the crackling fire and the occasional call of a night bird the only sounds. Abigail hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first bite touched her lips. She ate ravenously, color gradually returning to her pale cheeks. "Thank you," she said when she'd finished, embarrassed by how quickly she'd devoured the food. "For the meal and for what you did in town." Owen nodded, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. "You can take the bed, I'll sleep by the fire." "I couldn't." "You can and you will," he cut her off, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You've had a hard day." Abigail wanted to protest further but found herself swaying with exhaustion. She nodded in acquiescence. "At least tell me your full name before I retire." "I'd like to know who my rescuer is." "Owen Burke," he replied. "And yours?" "Abigail Turner." He inclined his head slightly. Rest well, Miss Turner. We'll figure out what comes next in the morning. As Abigail settled into the surprisingly comfortable bed, pulling the quilt around her shoulders, she found herself wondering about the enigmatic man who now lay on a bedroll near the fire. There was a story there in the scar along his jaw, in the way his eyes sometimes looked 1,000 miles away, in the careful way he'd shielded her from harm without knowing anything about her. She drifted to sleep with the strange realization that for the first time in years, she felt safe. Morning brought clarity and with it, a renewed sense of purpose for Abigail. She woke to find Owen already up, tending to his horse outside the cabin. She took advantage of his absence to splash water on her face from the basin he'd left in an attempt to restore some order to her appearance. When he returned, she was seated at the table, her hands folded before her. "Mr. Burke, I appreciate your kindness, but I can't impose on you further." Owen regarded her steadily. "Where will you go?" The question hung in the air between them. Abigail had no ready answer. She'd returned to Promise Creek, hoping to visit her father's grave and perhaps collect some of her mother's belongings from their old home, never expecting the town's hatred to have festered so strongly over the years. I have some money saved," she said finally. "Perhaps I could reach Helena and find work there." "Helena's a 3-day ride," Owen pointed out, "and not necessarily kind to a woman traveling alone." "I've managed on my own for 5 years," Abigail replied, a flash of pride straightening her spine. Owen's expression softened slightly. "I don't doubt your capability, Miss Turner. I'm merely pointing out the reality of the situation." He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "I need to head south to track the man I've been hunting. He's likely making for the Wyoming Territory. You're welcome to accompany me as far as the next sizable town. There, you might find safer passage to wherever you choose to go." Abigail considered his offer. There was logic in what he said, and something about Owen Burke made her believe he could be trusted. "Very well," she agreed. "But I insist on paying you for your trouble." "No payment necessary," he said firmly. "We can leave tomorrow at first light. Today, you should rest and recover your strength." Abigail found herself bristling at being told what to do, even if the advice was sound. "I'm not some delicate flower, Mr. Burke. I'm quite capable of traveling today." A hint of amusement flickered in his blue eyes. "Never suggested you were delicate, Miss Turner, but even the strongest riders need to rest sometimes. Besides," he added, moving toward the door, "I need to check my traps and restock supplies before we head out, unless you're eager to eat jerky and hardtack for the next few days." Without waiting for her response, he stepped outside, leaving Abigail to consider his words. She had to admit he had a point. Her body ached from the previous day's ordeal, and the prospect of a day to recuperate was appealing. Rising from the table, she decided to make herself useful. The cabin, while tidy, could use a woman's touch. She found a broom in the corner and set about sweeping the floor, then turned her attention to organizing the shelves of supplies. It felt good to be productive, to have a purpose beyond simply surviving another day. By midday, Owen had returned with 2 rabbits. He paused in the doorway, taking in the transformed space. The cabin now smelled of the wild sage Abigail had found growing nearby, and every surface gleamed with care. "You didn't have to do all this," he said, setting down his catch. "I wanted to," Abigail replied simply. "It seemed a fair exchange for your hospitality." Owen nodded, a gesture she was beginning to recognize as his preferred form of acknowledgement. "I'll clean these rabbits for a stew, unless you'd prefer something else." "Rabbit stew sounds wonderful," she assured him. "I found some wild onions and herbs while you were gone. They might make a nice addition." They worked together preparing the meal, moving around the small cabin with surprising ease. Abigail was struck by how comfortable it felt, this domestic rhythm with a man she'd only just met. There was something reassuring about Owen's quiet presence, his economy of movement, the way he seemed to anticipate what was needed without being asked. As the stew simmered over the fire, filling the cabin with savory aromas, Abigail's curiosity about her mysterious rescuer grew. "You're from Texas originally?" she asked, breaking the companionable silence. Owen glanced up from where he was cleaning his revolver at the table. "Born and raised near San Antonio. What brought you to Montana Territory?" He was quiet for so long that Abigail thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "A man can outrun a lot of things, but his past isn't one of them." "That sounds like the voice of experience," Abigail observed softly. His eyes met hers, and for a brief moment she glimpsed something vulnerable behind his stoic facade. "What about you? You mentioned your father was in Promise Creek." Abigail recognized the deflection but allowed it. "Yes. He was the town doctor until he passed away 6 years ago. My mother died when I was young. After my father's death, I stayed on, trying to help people with the medical knowledge he'd taught me." "That's how you got the reputation as a witch?" Owen asked, his voice neutral. Abigail nodded, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. "That and the remedies my grandmother taught me. She was Cherokee, married my grandfather when he was surveying land in the Oklahoma Territory. The people in Promise Creek were always suspicious of her ways, but they tolerated them because my father was respected." "What changed?" "There was a fever that swept through town 5 years ago," Abigail explained, her voice growing quieter. "I tried everything I knew to help, working day and night, but so many died, including the mayor's young son. In their grief, they needed someone to blame. I was an easy target, a half-breed woman using strange medicines." Owen's expression darkened. "So they drove you out?" "They came to burn down my home in the middle of the night," she confirmed. "I barely escaped with the clothes on my back and a few of my mother's keepsakes. I've been moving from place to place since then, never staying long enough for people to start asking questions." "And you came back because—" "I wanted to visit my father's grave," Abigail admitted, a catch in her voice. "And I foolishly thought that after 5 years their hatred might have cooled." Owen's hand tightened around the cleaning cloth he held. "People have long memories for the wrongs they think they've suffered, and short ones for the help they've received." The truth of his words hung in the air between them. Abigail stirred the stew, trying to keep her emotions in check. "It seems you know something about that too, Mr. Burke." "Owen," he corrected gently. "If we're going to be traveling together, you might as well use my given name." "Then you must call me Abigail," she responded with a small smile. The rest of the day passed in a comfortable rhythm of shared tasks and measured conversation. Owen proved to be a man of few words but thoughtful ones when he chose to speak. By evening, Abigail found herself looking forward to their journey together, even as she wondered what would happen when they inevitably parted ways. After dinner, Owen spread a map across the table, tracing their planned route with his finger. "We'll head southeast, following the Yellowstone River for a time before cutting across to the Powder River Basin. The man I'm tracking, Jasper Holt, was last seen heading for Deadwood." "What did he do?" Abigail asked. Owen's expression hardened. "Murdered a family in Colorado, parents and their teenage son. Took their money and valuables, then set fire to their home to cover his tracks." Abigail felt a chill at the matter-of-fact way Owen described such brutality. "And you're going to bring him to justice?" "That's the plan," he confirmed, folding the map with precise movements. "The bounty's good $500, but this one's not just about the money." "What do you mean?" Owen hesitated, as though weighing how much to reveal. "I knew the family." Thomas Green gave me work when I first came north, no questions asked. He was a good man. His wife Sarah always had extra food ready when hands came in from the range. Their boy, Michael, was just 15. His voice grew rough with emotion he clearly wasn't accustomed to expressing. They deserved better than what happened to them. Abigail reached across the table on impulse, laying her hand over his. I'm sorry for your loss. Owen looked down at their hands, seemingly startled by the contact. After a moment, he nodded and gently withdrew his hand. We should turn in early. Dawn comes quick, and we've got a long day of riding ahead. That night, as Abigail once again took the bed while Owen made his place by the fire, she found herself studying his profile in the dimming firelight. There were layers to this man that intrigued her, the hardness required for his profession balanced against the kindness he'd shown her. The taciturn exterior that occasionally revealed glimpses of deep feeling. She fell asleep wondering what it would be like to know the real Owen Burke, the man behind the carefully constructed walls. Morning arrived with a gentle rain that pattered against the cabin roof. Owen was already up and moving when Abigail opened her eyes, packing supplies and checking his weapons with practiced efficiency. Weather might slow us down, he commented when he noticed she was awake, but we should still make decent progress if it doesn't get worse. Abigail nodded, quickly rising and preparing herself for the journey. She helped pack the remaining supplies while Owen saddled his horse, and a second mount he'd retrieved from the barn, a sturdy bay mare that regarded Abigail with intelligent eyes. She's called Pepper, Owen explained as Abigail stroked the mare's nose. Belonged to a friend who doesn't need her anymore. Something in his tone suggested there was more to the story, but Abigail didn't press. They set out as the rain lightened to a misty drizzle. The landscape transformed into shades of gray and green around them. Owen rode slightly ahead, his posture alert as his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings. Abigail found comfort in his vigilance, even as she maintained her own awareness of the terrain. They made good time despite the weather, stopping briefly at midday to eat a cold lunch of jerky and biscuits before continuing on. Conversation was sparse but not uncomfortable, the steady rhythm of their horses' hooves filling the silence. As afternoon wore on, the clouds began to break, allowing patches of sunlight to dapple the trail ahead. Owen reined his horse to a stop near a grove of cottonwoods beside a small stream. We'll rest the horses here for a bit, he decided. There's a trading post about 10 miles ahead where we can spend the night. Abigail dismounted gratefully, stretching her legs as Owen led both horses to the stream to drink. She wandered a short distance away, drawn by the colorful wildflowers that dotted the grassy area beneath the trees. Indian paintbrush, she murmured, kneeling to examine the vibrant red blooms. My grandmother used these for treating rheumatism. You know a lot about plants, Owen observed, approaching quietly. Abigail nodded without looking up. Plants don't judge or spread rumors. They just are what they are, doing what they're meant to do. Sounds like you prefer their company to people's. Wouldn't you, after what happened in Promise Creek? She asked, finally glancing up at him. Owen considered her question seriously. Can't say I blame you. People can be cruel when they're afraid. He hesitated before adding, but not all people are the same. No, Abigail agreed softly. Some ride in and stand between a stranger and a mob without knowing the whole story. A hint of color touched Owen's cheeks at her words. He cleared his throat and changed the subject. We should move on if we want to reach the trading post before dark. The trading post turned out to be a collection of rough-hewn buildings clustered around a dusty yard, a general store, a small stable, and a 2-story structure that served as both saloon and lodging house. A weathered sign proclaimed it, Willow Creek Trading Company, ESD, 1862. As they approached, Abigail felt the familiar weight of scrutiny as several men lounging on the porch of the saloon turned to watch their arrival. She instinctively moved her horse closer to Owen's, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "Stay close," he murmured as they dismounted in front of the stable. "This place sees all types, not all of them friendly." The stable boy who came to take their horses was barely in his teens, thin and wiry with a shock of red hair. "2 bits a night per horse, feed included," he recited, clearly accustomed to the transaction. Owen paid him, adding an extra coin. "Make sure they get a good rubdown and the best feed you've got." The boy's eyes widened at the generosity. "Yes, sir, I'll take real good care of them." With their horses settled, Owen led the way to the lodging house, his hand resting casually near his holstered revolver. The interior was dimly lit and heavy with the scents of whiskey, tobacco, and unwashed bodies. A handful of patrons occupied the tables, while a bored-looking bartender polished glasses behind the scarred wooden bar. Conversations momentarily halted as they entered, a dozen pairs of eyes assessing the newcomers before gradually returning to their drinks and card games. Abigail felt acutely aware of her appearance, travel-worn and dusty, her hair coming loose from its pins. Owen approached the bar with confidence, positioning himself so that Abigail was slightly behind him, shielded from most of the room's occupants. "Evening," he addressed the bartender. "Need 2 rooms for the night if you've got them." The bartender, a burly man with a bushy mustache and a scar across one eyebrow, looked between them with open curiosity. "Only got 1 room available. 2 beds, though." He named a price that seemed inflated even for frontier accommodations. Owen didn't argue, simply placing the coins on the counter. "We'll take it, and 2 hot meals." The bartender scooped up the money with practiced efficiency. "Stew's just about ready. Martha," he called toward the back, "show these folks to room 3 and bring up some wash water." A middle-aged woman with a careworn face appeared from a back room, wiping her hands on her apron. "This way," she instructed, leading them up a narrow staircase to the 2nd floor. The room was small but clean, with 2 narrow beds, a washstand, and a single window overlooking the yard below. Martha promised to return shortly with hot water and fresh towels, giving Abigail a sympathetic look before departing. Once they were alone, Owen moved to the window, surveying the grounds with a professional eye. "We'll eat downstairs and turn in early," he decided. "I want to be on the road at first light." Abigail sat on the edge of one bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the strangeness of her situation. Just 2 days ago, she had been fleeing for her life. Now she was sharing a room with a bounty hunter she barely knew, embarking on a journey with no clear destination. "What happens when we reach the next town?" she asked, voicing the question that had been nagging at her. "After we part ways." Owen turned from the window, his expression thoughtful. "That depends on what you want, Abigail. Where do you see yourself going?" It was a simple question with no simple answer. "I've been running for so long," she admitted. "I don't know where I belong anymore." Something in Owen's face softened. "I understand that feeling." He moved to sit on the bed opposite her, their knees nearly touching in the small space. "For what it's worth, I think you deserved better than what Promise Creek gave you." The unexpected kindness in his words brought a lump to Abigail's throat. Before she could respond, a knock at the door announced Martha's return with the promised wash water. They took turns freshening up, maintaining a respectful distance that belied the growing connection between them. By the time they descended to the saloon for their evening meal, Abigail felt more composed, though increasingly aware of Owen's every movement and glance. The main room had filled considerably in their absence, the atmosphere louder and more boisterous as miners and travelers sought respite from the day's labors. Owen secured them a small table in the corner, positioning himself with his back to the wall and a clear view of both the main entrance and the stairs. The stew was surprisingly good chunks of venison and vegetables in a rich broth, served with warm bread that actually tasted fresh. Abigail ate hungrily, realizing how the day's ride had depleted her energy. "This is delicious," she commented between bites. Owen nodded in agreement, his own bowl nearly empty. "Martha's a good cook. Used to run her own place in Virginia City before her husband gambled it away. You know her?" Abigail asked, surprised. "Passed through here a few times," Owen explained. "You learn things in my line of work. Information can be as valuable as a loaded gun sometimes." Their meal was interrupted by a commotion near the bar. A heavily bearded man in filthy prospector's clothes was arguing loudly with the bartender, his words slurred by drink. "I said I'll pay tomorrow when my partner gets back," the prospector insisted, pounding his fist on the bar. "He owes me for the claim anyway." "And I said no credit," the bartender replied firmly. "Pay up or get out, Silas." The situation escalated quickly as Silas grabbed for a bottle behind the bar, prompting the bartender to produce a shotgun from beneath the counter. The room went silent as the barrel leveled at the prospector's chest. "Don't make me use this," the bartender warned. "Just walk away." Silas swayed on his feet, alcohol clearly clouding his judgment. His hand inched toward the knife at his belt. "You think I'm afraid of that scattergun, Frank? I've faced down Blackfoot warriors with nothing but a rock in my bare hands." Owen sighed almost imperceptibly before rising from his seat. "Stay here," he murmured to Abigail before approaching the standoff with measured steps. "Evening, gentlemen," he said, his voice calm but carrying authority. "Seems we have a misunderstanding that doesn't require bloodshed." Both men turned to look at him, the bartender's shotgun never wavering from its target. "This ain't your business, stranger," Silas growled. "Maybe not," Owen agreed reasonably. "But I'd hate to have my dinner interrupted by gunfire." He reached into his pocket and placed a coin on the bar. "This should cover the man's drink. Why don't you sit down, friend, and we can avoid any unpleasantness?" For a tense moment, Silas seemed to consider refusing. Then his bleary eyes focused on the star-shaped badge pinned to Owen's vest, a Texas Rangers badge that Abigail hadn't noticed before. "Didn't realize you was law," Silas muttered, his bravado deflating. He reluctantly backed away from the bar, nodding to Owen. "Appreciate the drink, Marshal." The bartender lowered his shotgun, nodding gratefully to Owen as conversation gradually resumed around the room. Owen returned to their table, seeming unaffected by the encounter. "You're still wearing your ranger badge," Abigail observed quietly. Owen's hand moved to the star on his vest, his expression unreadable. "Sometimes it's useful to let people think I'm still with the Rangers, makes them think twice. But isn't that—" Abigail hesitated, searching for the right word. "Dishonest," Owen supplied with a hint of irony. "Maybe. But if it prevents blood from being spilled, I can live with it." They finished their meal in thoughtful silence before retiring to their room. The awareness of sharing such an intimate space grew more pronounced as they prepared for sleep. Owen insisted on taking the bed nearest the door, his gun belt hanging from the bedpost within easy reach. "I'll turn my back while you get settled," he offered, showing a consideration that touched Abigail deeply. She quickly changed into her nightgown behind the privacy screen that Martha had thoughtfully provided, then slipped beneath the covers of her bed. "I'm decent now," she called softly. Owen turned, his eyes meeting hers across the small space between their beds. In the soft glow of the oil lamp, his features looked less weathered, almost boyish despite the scar along his jaw. "Thank you, Owen," Abigail said sincerely. "For what? For everything. For saving me in Promise Creek, for bringing me with you, for seeing me as a person worth protecting." Something flickered in Owen's eyes and emotion quickly masked. "Get some rest, Abigail. We've got another long day tomorrow." He extinguished the lamp, plunging the room into darkness save for the faint moonlight filtering through the window. Abigail lay awake for some time, listening to Owen's steady breathing from the other bed, wondering about the man who seemed to carry so much beneath his composed exterior. Just before sleep claimed her, she heard him shift in his bed. "You're worth protecting," he whispered so quietly she almost missed it. "Don't ever think otherwise." The warmth that bloomed in her chest at his words followed her into her dreams. Their departure from the trading post the next morning was delayed by a heavy fog that blanketed the area, reducing visibility to mere feet in any direction. Owen was reluctant to set out until it lifted, concerned about losing their way or riding into an ambush. "Holt has friends who wouldn't mind seeing me dead," he explained grimly as they shared breakfast in the saloon. "Best not to make their job easier." By mid-morning, the fog had begun to dissipate, revealing a clear day beyond its shroud. They set out at a brisk pace, making up for lost time as they followed a well-traveled trail that wound through increasingly rugged terrain. As they rode, Abigail found herself studying Owen when he wasn't looking the confident way he sat his horse, the alertness that never seemed to leave him even in seemingly peaceful moments, the occasional softness that crossed his features when he thought she wasn't watching. They stopped to rest the horses near midday beside a swift-flowing creek. While Owen refilled their canteens, Abigail stretched her legs, working out the stiffness from hours in the saddle. The landscape here was beautiful rolling hills covered in wildflowers, stands of aspen trees whose leaves shimmered in the breeze, mountains rising majestically in the distance. "It's hard to believe there's danger in such a beautiful place," she remarked as Owen rejoined her. "Beauty and danger often go hand in hand out here," he replied, handing her a filled canteen. "Like those flowers you're admiring, pretty to look at, but some of them are poisonous if you don't know what you're handling." Abigail smiled at the comparison. "Is that how you see me, Mr. Burke?" "Beautiful but dangerous." The question seemed to catch him off guard. Color rose in his cheeks as he struggled for a response. That's not what I meant to imply." "I'm teasing you," Abigail assured him, enjoying the rare moment of seeing the composed bounty hunter flustered. "Though I'm flattered you might find me beautiful." Owen cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the turn in conversation. "We should keep moving. There's a settlement about 15 miles ahead where we can spend the night." They mounted up and continued their journey, but something had shifted between them, an awareness that hadn't been there before, or perhaps had been there but unacknowledged until now. The afternoon brought darkening skies and the distant rumble of thunder. Owen pushed them to maintain their pace, keen to reach shelter before the impending storm broke. They were still several miles from the settlement when the first heavy drops began to fall. "There's an old line shack about a mile from here," Owen called over the rising wind. "We'll head there instead." The rain was falling in earnest by the time the small cabin came into view, a simple one-room structure built for cowboys working the range during roundup. They dismounted in a rush, leading the horses to a lean-to beside the cabin that offered minimal protection from the elements. Inside, the shack was dusty but sound, the roof intact save for one small leak in the corner. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, while a narrow cot stood against another. A rough table with a single chair completed the sparse furnishings. Not exactly the accommodations I'd planned, Owen apologized as he shook water from his hat. But it'll keep us dry. Abigail wrung water from her skirts, shivering slightly in the damp chill. It's perfect. Though I think I'm soaked through to the skin. Owen immediately set about building a fire, his movements quick and efficient. Soon, flames were dancing in the hearth, casting a warm glow throughout the small space. He rummaged in his saddlebags, producing a spare shirt and offering it to Abigail. "You should change into something dry," he said, turning his back to give her privacy. "I'll check on the horses." Left alone, Abigail gratefully stripped off her wet clothing, using a relatively clean corner of her petticoat to dry herself before pulling on Owen's shirt. The garment was comically large on her smaller frame, reaching nearly to her knees, but it was warm and smelled faintly of him, a not unpleasant combination of leather, pine, and something uniquely Owen. She spread her wet clothes near the fire to dry, then used her fingers to comb through her damp hair, allowing it to hang loose down her back rather than attempting to pin it up again with wet strands. When Owen returned, his steps faltered briefly at the sight of her in his shirt, her dark hair cascading around her shoulders. He quickly averted his eyes, moving to hang his wet coat near the fire. "Storm's settling in for the night," he reported, his voice slightly rough. "Horses are as comfortable as they can be. I gave them extra feed to keep them warm." Abigail nodded, suddenly self-conscious about her appearance. "Thank you for the shirt. I hope you don't mind." "No," Owen said quickly. It suits you." The compliment, awkwardly delivered though it was, brought a smile to Abigail's lips. "I doubt that very much, but it's certainly more comfortable than wet clothes." Owen busied himself with preparing a simple meal from their supplies, seemingly grateful for the distraction. The storm intensified outside, rain lashing against the small window and wind howling around the eaves of the cabin. Thunder crashed occasionally, causing the horses to whinny nervously from their shelter. They ate in companionable silence, the fire crackling cheerfully in contrast to the tempest outside. The close quarters made Abigail acutely aware of Owen's presence, the breadth of his shoulders, the way firelight played across his features, the careful way he moved to maintain a respectful distance despite the limited space. "Will this delay your pursuit of Holt?" she asked, partly to break the growing tension and partly out of genuine curiosity. Owen considered the question. "Possibly, but he'll be held up by this weather too. We might even gain ground if he's camping in the open." "You've been tracking him for 3 weeks," Abigail observed. "You must be very determined." "I always complete a job I take on," Owen replied, his tone matter of fact. "But this one's different." "Because you knew the family," he nodded, his expression growing somber. "Thomas Green gave me work when most wouldn't look twice at an ex-ranger with a reputation. He trusted me when I'd stopped trusting myself." Abigail sensed there was more to the story. "What happened? With the Rangers, I mean." Owen was silent for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost as if he were speaking to himself rather than to her. "I was assigned to a border town, supposed to keep the peace, enforce the law." His jaw tightened at the memory. "The captain I served under had his own ideas about what that meant. He wasn't concerned with justice, just power. Took bribes, looked the other way when certain crimes were committed, used excessive force against those who couldn't fight back." "That sounds terrible," Abigail said softly. "It was. I reported him to headquarters, thought they'd remove him." Owen's laugh was bitter. "Instead, they transferred me, said I was causing division in the ranks. 3 months later, he and his men rode into a Mexican settlement, claiming they were hunting bandits. 8 people died, including 2 children." Abigail's hand covered her mouth in horror. "Oh, Owen, I testified against him at the inquiry. He was dismissed from service but never faced criminal charges. Owen's eyes met hers, filled with old pain. After that, the badge didn't mean what it once did to me. I couldn't wear it with pride anymore. Yet you still carry it, Abigail pointed out gently. As a reminder, he admitted, of what happens when good people stay silent. The vulnerability in his confession touched something deep within Abigail. Without thinking, she reached across the small space between them, taking his hand in hers. Owen looked down at their joined hands with surprise, but he didn't pull away. "I think you're a good man, Owen Burke," she said simply. "Better than you give yourself credit for." His fingers tightened around hers briefly before he released her hand, rising to add more wood to the fire. The moment passed, but something fundamental had changed between them, a trust established, barriers lowered. As night deepened and the storm showed no signs of abating, the question of sleeping arrangements became inevitable. The shack contained only the single narrow cot, barely wide enough for one person, let alone two. "You take the cot," Owen insisted. "I'll be fine on the floor near the fire." "That's ridiculous," Abigail protested. "The floor is cold and hard. We could share the cot." The suggestion brought heat to her cheeks, but she forged ahead. "We're both adults, and it's just for one night." Owen looked genuinely flustered for the first time since she'd met him. "I couldn't. It wouldn't be proper. More proper than letting you catch your death on a cold floor." Abigail countered. "I trust you, Owen. I know you're a gentleman." The struggle was visible on his face, propriety warring with practicality, and perhaps with something else, something neither of them was quite ready to name. Finally, he nodded. "If you're certain." "I am." The arrangements were awkward at first, both of them lying rigid on the narrow cot, trying desperately not to touch. Abigail lay on her side, facing the wall, while Owen positioned himself at the very edge of the mattress, in danger of falling off entirely. "This is absurd," Abigail finally said with a small laugh. "We can't sleep like this. We'll both end up on the floor by morning." Owen chuckled despite himself. "You're probably right." Hesitantly, they adjusted their positions until they found a more comfortable arrangement. Abigail curled on her side, Owen's arm draped carefully over her waist, their bodies fitting together like puzzle pieces. It was startlingly intimate, yet somehow it felt right. "Is this acceptable?" Owen asked, his breath warm against her hair. "Yes," Abigail whispered, surprised by how true it was. She felt safe in his arms, protected in a way she hadn't experienced in years. As the storm raged outside and the fire crackled in the hearth, they gradually relaxed into each other's warmth. Abigail found herself drifting toward sleep, lulled by the steady rhythm of Owen's heartbeat against her back. "Abigail," he murmured, his voice thick with approaching sleep. "I'm glad I found you in Promise Creek." She smiled in the darkness. "So am I, Owen, so am I." Morning arrived with gentle sunlight streaming through the cabin's single window, the storm having passed during the night. Abigail woke slowly, momentarily disoriented before becoming acutely aware of Owen's arm still wrapped around her waist, his body a solid presence at her back. His steady breathing told her he was still asleep. She remained still, savoring the unfamiliar but welcome sensation of being held. It had been so long since anyone had touched her with tenderness, years of keeping people at a distance, of guarding herself against the prejudice and fear her mixed heritage and healing knowledge often provoked. Owen stirred behind her, his arm tightening briefly around her waist before he seemed to come fully awake and realize their position. He withdrew his arm carefully, clearing his throat as he sat up. "I apologize if I—" he began awkwardly. "Don't," Abigail interrupted gently, turning to face him. "There's nothing to apologize for." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of the growing connection neither had anticipated. For a moment, it seemed Owen might say more, but instead he nodded and rose from the cot. "We should get an early start," he said, moving to check on the fire. "The ground will be muddy but passable." They prepared for the day's journey in companionable silence, each stealing glances at the other when they thought themselves unobserved. Abigail changed back into her now dry clothing, reluctantly relinquishing Owen's shirt, which had provided such comfort during the night. The world outside was transformed by the storm puddles glittering in the morning light, vegetation washed clean and vibrant with renewed color. The horses seemed eager to resume their journey, nickering softly as Owen and Abigail approached with saddles and bridles. "The settlement's about 10 miles from here," Owen informed her as they mounted up. "We should reach it by midday." The ride was indeed slower than anticipated, the trail muddy and treacherous in places. They picked their way carefully, sometimes dismounting to lead the horses through particularly challenging sections. Despite the difficult conditions, Abigail found herself enjoying the journey, appreciating the wild beauty of the landscape and, increasingly, the company of her taciturn companion. "What will you do after you find Holt?" she asked as they paused to rest the horses beside a swollen creek. Owen's expression grew serious. "Take him in to face justice for what he did. The reward money will go to Green's sister in St. Louis. She's got young children and not much else." And then, he shrugged, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "Find the next job, I suppose. It's what I do." "Is it what you want to do?" Abigail pressed gently. Forever, the question seemed to catch him off guard. "I haven't thought much beyond the next bounty," he admitted. "This life, it suits me. I work alone, answer to no one but myself." "It sounds lonely," Abigail observed, not unkindly. Owen's eyes met hers, something vulnerable flickering in their blue depths. "Maybe it has been, until recently." The simple acknowledgement sent a flutter through Abigail's chest. Before she could respond, Owen had turned away, adjusting his horse's saddle with unnecessary attention. "We should keep moving," he said, his voice gruffer than usual. "Storms left the trail worse than I expected." They resumed their journey, the conversation shifting to safer topics: the geography of the region, the wildlife they encountered, Abigail's knowledge of medicinal plants. Yet beneath the casual exchange ran an undercurrent of awareness, of possibilities neither quite dared to voice. The settlement they reached by early afternoon was larger than Abigail had expected, not merely a trading post, but a growing town with several streets of buildings, including a proper hotel, a church, and even a small schoolhouse. The sign at the edge of town proclaimed it: "Silver Springs, founded 1868. "This is more established than I remembered," Owen remarked as they rode down the main street, drawing curious glances from townspeople going about their business. Silver Strike 2 years ago must have brought in more settlers. They stopped at the livery stable first, arranging care for their horses, before making their way to the hotel, a 2-story building with actual glass windows and a freshly painted sign. Inside, the lobby was modestly appointed but clean, with a polished reception desk and several chairs for guests. The clerk, a thin man with spectacles perched on his nose, greeted them with professional courtesy. "Welcome to the Silver Springs Hotel. How may I help you folks today?" "2 rooms, please," Owen requested, placing coins on the counter. The clerk consulted his ledger. "We have adjoining rooms available on the 2nd floor. Will that suit?" Owen glanced at Abigail, who nodded her agreement. "That'll be fine." As they followed the clerk upstairs to their rooms, Abigail was struck by a sudden realization they were approaching the next phase of their journey, the point at which their paths might diverge. The thought brought an unexpected ache to her chest. The rooms were simple but comfortable, each containing a bed, washstand, small desk, and chair. A connecting door between them stood closed but unlocked, offering both privacy and accessibility. "There's a dining room downstairs," the clerk informed them. "Dinner service begins at 6. If you require anything else, just ring for service." With that, he departed, leaving them standing awkwardly in the hallway between their respective doors. "I thought we might inquire about Holt while we're here," Owen said, breaking the silence. "Someone might have seen him pass through." "Of course," Abigail agreed. "Would you like me to accompany you?" Owen hesitated. "It might be better if I go alone. Some of the places I'll need to check aren't suitable for a lady." Though mildly disappointed, Abigail understood his reasoning. "In that case, I might explore the town a bit. Perhaps visit the general store for a few necessities." They agreed to meet for dinner later and parted ways, each to their own room. Alone for the first time in days, Abigail found the silence oppressive. She had grown accustomed to Owen's steady presence, his quiet strength and unexpected moments of tenderness. After washing away the dust of travel and changing into her spare dress, somewhat wrinkled but presentable Abigail ventured out to explore Silver Springs. The town was bustling with activity, a mix of miners, merchants, ranchers, and families going about their business. The general store was well stocked, offering a wider selection of goods than Abigail had seen in some time. She purchased a few personal items, as well as a small notebook and pencil, indulging her habit of recording medicinal plants and their properties. As she browsed the fabric section, considering whether she could afford material for a new dress, a conversation nearby caught her attention. "Did you hear they found another body out by Clearwater Creek?" a woman whispered to her companion. "Throat slit, just like the Carson boy last month." "Terrible business," her friend replied with a shudder. "Sheriff thinks it might be that Holt fellow they're hunting from Colorado. They say he's making his way to Deadwood." Abigail's blood ran cold at the mention of Holt's name. If he had been in this area recently, Owen might be closer to his quarry than he realized, a prospect both promising and deeply concerning. She completed her purchases quickly and headed back to the hotel, eager to share this information with Owen. The hotel lobby was empty save for the clerk when she entered, no sign of the bounty hunter's return. Back in her room, Abigail paced restlessly, torn between waiting for Owen and seeking him out. The news of another murder attributed to Holt weighed heavily on her mind, not just for the sake of justice, but for Owen's safety. The man he pursued was clearly dangerous, willing to kill again and again to avoid capture. As dusk began to fall, Abigail's concern grew. She moved to the connecting door between their rooms, hesitating only briefly before knocking gently. When no answer came, she opened it cautiously, confirming that Owen had not returned. Dinner time came and went with no sign of him. Abigail forced herself to eat a small meal in the hotel dining room, though anxiety robbed her of appetite. By the time full darkness had descended, her worry had transformed into genuine fear. She was preparing to go look for him when a commotion in the hallway drew her attention. Opening her door, she found Owen being supported by two men, blood staining his shirt and a grim expression on his pain-etched face. "Owen," she gasped, rushing forward. "What happened?" "Got jumped outside the Rusty Nail Saloon," one of the men explained as they helped Owen into his room. Three fellows took exception to his questions about Holt. Might have killed him if some miners hadn't stepped in. Abigail's nursing instincts took over immediately. "Put him on the bed. I need hot water, clean cloths, and a bottle of whiskey if you can get it." While the men went to fulfill her requests, Abigail gently helped Owen remove his bloodied shirt. A deep knife wound in his left shoulder appeared to be the worst injury, though bruises were already forming across his ribs and face. "This was careless of me," Owen muttered, wincing as she began to examine the wound. "Should have been more alert." "Save your self-recrimination for later," Abigail instructed firmly. "Right now, I need to stop this bleeding." When the requested items arrived, she set to work cleaning and treating Owen's injuries with practiced efficiency. The knife wound required stitching, a procedure she performed with steady hands despite her inner turmoil. Owen remained stoically silent throughout the painful process, his jaw clenched and eyes fixed on the ceiling. Only when she applied a mixture of herbs from her small medicine pouch did he speak again. "What is that?" he asked, the scent of the poultice filling the room. "Yarrow and comfrey," Abigail explained as she worked, "to stop the bleeding and help with healing. My grandmother taught me the proper mixture. The witch's remedies that frightened Promise Creek." There was no judgment in his tone, only curiosity. Abigail nodded, concentrating on bandaging his shoulder. "People fear what they don't understand. These plants have been used for healing long before doctors with their fancy medical degrees came west." When she had finished tending to his wounds, Abigail helped Owen take a small dose of laudanum for the pain, despite his protests that he didn't need it. "You need rest to heal," she insisted. "And you'll rest better if you're not in agony." Too weak to argue further, Owen acquiesced. As the medicine began to take effect, his eyelids grew heavy. "Abigail," he murmured, catching her hand as she adjusted his pillows. "Be careful if Holt's men know I'm here." "I'll be vigilant," she promised. "Now sleep. I'll be right here." She remained at his bedside long after he had drifted into a laudanum-induced slumber, her mind racing with implications. Owen's attack confirmed that Holt was nearby, possibly even in Silver Springs. The danger had suddenly become immediate and personal. Despite her exhaustion, Abigail stayed awake through the night, periodically checking Owen's bandages and fever status. By morning, she was relieved to find his wounds showing no signs of infection, and his fever mild rather than raging. He woke as dawn's light filtered through the curtains, momentarily confused before his eyes found Abigail dozing in the chair beside his bed. "You stayed all night," he observed, his voice rough from sleep and medication. Abigail startled awake, immediately moving to check his bandages. "Of course I did. How are you feeling?" "Like I lost a fight with an angry bear," Owen admitted with a grimace as he attempted to sit up. "But I've had worse." "Lie still," Abigail admonished, gently pressing him back against the pillows. "The stitches need time to set properly." Owen complied, though frustration was evident in his expression. "Holt's close. The bartender at the Rusty Nail confirmed he was there 3 days ago, headed for the mining camp at Broken Ridge." "I heard talk at the general store about another murder," Abigail told him, "at Clearwater Creek. They're saying it was Holt's work." Owen's expression darkened. "That makes 5 that we know of since Colorado. He's getting more desperate and more dangerous." "Which is precisely why you need to heal before pursuing him further," Abigail insisted. "You can't bring him to justice if you're dead." The bluntness of her statement seemed to give Owen pause. After a moment, he nodded reluctantly. 2 days. Then we move on to Broken Ridge." Abigail noted his use of "we" with a mixture of relief and apprehension. She had assumed their paths would diverge in Silver Springs. Yet Owen seemed to be taking her continued presence for granted. The realization brought both joy and uncertainty: joy at remaining in his company, uncertainty about what it might mean for her future. The next 2 days established a new rhythm between them. Abigail tended Owen's wounds, prepared herbal remedies to speed his healing, and ventured out only briefly for supplies and information. Owen, for his part, was a surprisingly compliant patient, perhaps recognizing that his recovery depended on following Abigail's instructions. Their forced proximity within the confines of the hotel room deepened their connection in ways neither had anticipated. They shared stories of their pasts, Abigail speaking of her childhood, with a father who encouraged her interest in medicine, and a grandmother who taught her to respect the old ways. Owen revealing more about his years as a ranger and the events that had led him to bounty hunting. By the evening of the second day, Owen was moving more easily, his natural vigor returning despite the still healing wound in his shoulder. They shared dinner in his room, a simple meal brought up from the hotel kitchen, accompanied by a bottle of surprisingly decent wine. "We'll leave for Broken Ridge at first light," Owen decided as they finished their meal. "If we make good time, we could be there by nightfall." Abigail nodded, though a shadow crossed her features. The wine had loosened her tongue, making her more willing to voice the question that had been nagging at her. "And after that, after you find Holt?" Owen studied her face in the lamplight, something soft and uncertain in his gaze. "I've been thinking about that," he admitted. "About what comes next." "And?" Abigail prompted when he didn't continue. Owen set down his wine glass, his expression serious. "I've been alone for a long time, Abigail, convinced myself it was better that way, safer, simpler. But these past days with you—" He hesitated, seeming to struggle for words. Abigail's heart quickened. "Yes, they've made me question things I thought I knew for certain," Owen continued, his voice low and sincere. "About my life, about what I want from it." He reached across the small table between them, taking her hand in his. The gesture was gentle, but filled with meaning. "I don't know exactly what the future holds, but I do know I'm not ready to say goodbye to you in Broken Ridge or anywhere else." Abigail felt tears prick her eyes at the simple honesty in his words. "I'm not ready for that either," she confessed softly. Owen's thumb traced a gentle pattern across her knuckles. "When this business with Holt is finished, perhaps we could find somewhere to start fresh, together." The proposal for "that's what it was" in its own understated way took Abigail's breath away. "You would want that? A life with someone like me?" Owen's brow furrowed at her question. "What do you mean, someone like you?" "A half-breed woman with a reputation for witchcraft," Abigail clarified, her voice catching. "Someone who's been driven from her home and might be again. I would bring complications to your life, Owen." "Life is complicated," he replied simply, "but it's better faced together than alone." His blue eyes held hers steadily. "I'm not asking for promises, Abigail, just a chance to see where this path might lead us." The sincerity in his gaze melted away her doubts. "I would like that very much," she whispered. The moment hung between them, charged with possibility. Slowly, Owen leaned forward, giving Abigail every opportunity to pull away. When she didn't, his lips met hers in a kiss that was tentative at first, then deepening as she responded with unexpected fervor. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Owen's expression was one of wonder and tender affection. "I've wanted to do that since that night in the line shack," he admitted. Abigail smiled, a blush coloring her cheeks. "I've wanted you to since then as well." They retired to their separate rooms shortly after, both aware that taking their newfound feelings further would be premature. Yet Abigail fell asleep with a sense of hope she hadn't experienced in years, a feeling that perhaps her long journey of solitude was coming to an end. Morning brought clear skies and a renewed sense of purpose. They departed Silver Springs as planned, riding north toward the mining settlement of Broken Ridge. Owen's injury slowed their pace somewhat, but his determination was evident in every mile they covered. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as they approached the mining region, steep hillsides scarred by prospecting, streams running cloudy with silt from sluice boxes, occasional clusters of tents and crude cabins marking the presence of those seeking their fortune in the earth. Broken Ridge itself was less a town than a sprawling encampment, a main street lined with hastily constructed buildings serving the needs of miners, surrounded by a disorganized array of tents, shacks, and mining claims spreading up the mountainside. "Charming," Abigail remarked dryly as they rode past a group of clearly inebriated miners despite the early hour. Owen's expression was grim. "Mining camps aren't known for their refinement. Stay close to me and keep your eyes open. Holt could be anywhere." They secured lodging at the only establishment that could generously be called a hotel, a 2-story wooden structure with narrow rooms and paper-thin walls. The proprietor, a heavy-set woman with shrewd eyes and a no-nonsense manner, looked them over critically. "Don't want no trouble in my place," she declared, accepting Owen's payment. "Had enough of that last week when some fella shot up the card room." Owen's attention sharpened. "What did this man look like?" The woman shrugged. "Tall, dark hair, nasty scar across his nose. Called himself Johnson, but I heard one of his partners call him Holt when they thought no one was listening." Abigail felt Owen tense beside her. "When did he leave?" he asked, keeping his tone casual despite the intensity in his eyes. "Day before yesterday. Headed up to the high-stakes claim from what I heard. Works as a guard for Simmons now." She eyed them suspiciously. "You folks got business with him?" "Just an old acquaintance," Owen replied smoothly. "Much obliged for the information, madam." Once they were alone in Owen's room, his controlled demeanor gave way to focused energy. "The high stakes is about 3 miles north of here," he explained, checking his revolver with practiced movements. "One of the richest claims in the area, which means well guarded." "You're going after him now?" Abigail asked, concern evident in her voice. "Your shoulder hasn't fully healed." "It's healed enough," Owen insisted. "Every day Holt remains free is another day someone else might die. I can't risk that." Abigail recognized the determination in his stance. This wasn't a battle she would win. "Then I'm coming with you," she declared. Owen looked up sharply. "Absolutely not. It's too dangerous." "I'm not suggesting I join the actual confrontation," Abigail clarified, holding her ground. "But I can wait nearby. If you're injured, if you need medical help." The logic of her argument was undeniable, though Owen clearly disliked the idea of bringing her anywhere near potential danger. After a moment of internal struggle, he nodded reluctantly. "You stay well back, out of sight," he insisted. "And if there's trouble, any trouble at all, you ride for help. Understand?" Abigail agreed to his terms, though privately she resolved to use her own judgment should circumstances demand it. They set out within the hour, following a rough trail that wound up the mountainside toward the high-stakes claim. The mining operation came into view as they crested a ridge, a substantial operation with several wooden buildings, a large water sluice, and guards posted at strategic points around the perimeter. Men moved about the site like ants, some hauling ore, others working various aspects of the extraction process. Owen guided them to a secluded spot with a clear view of the camp, but well concealed by a stand of pine trees. "Wait here," he instructed Abigail as he dismounted. "If I'm not back in 2 hours, return to town and find the law." Before she could respond, he surprised her by pulling her into a brief but intense kiss. "For luck," he murmured against her lips before releasing her. Abigail watched with a mixture of pride and fear as Owen made his way toward the mining camp, moving with the stealth and purpose of a predator closing in on its prey. Soon, he had disappeared from view, leaving her alone with her thoughts and mounting anxiety. Time passed with excruciating slowness. Abigail found herself counting the minutes, then seconds, her eyes constantly scanning the mining camp for any sign of Owen or unusual activity. The sun inched across the sky, shadows lengthening as afternoon progressed toward evening. When the first gunshot rang out, Abigail's heart nearly stopped. It was followed quickly by several more, a chaotic eruption of violence that sent miners scattering for cover. From her vantage point, she could see figures running, some taking defensive positions, others fleeing the scene entirely. Unable to remain passive any longer, Abigail mounted her horse and urged it forward, staying within the tree line but moving closer to the camp. The gunfire had ceased, replaced by an ominous silence that frightened her more than the shots had. She had nearly reached the edge of the camp when a figure burst from between two buildings, a tall man with dark hair and a distinctive scar across his nose, precisely matching the description of Jasper Holt. He was moving fast, heading for the horses tethered at the far side of the camp. Before he could reach them, another figure emerged in pursuit. Owen, his gun drawn, blood visible on his shirt even from Abigail's distance. "Holt!" he shouted. "It's over!" Holt spun, firing wildly in Owen's direction. Owen dove for cover, returning fire with more precision. One of his bullets found its mark, causing Holt to stagger, but the wounded man continued his desperate flight toward the horses. Abigail's mind raced. If Holt reached those horses, he would escape and Owen, already injured, might not be able to catch him. Without fully thinking through the consequences, she spurred her horse forward, breaking from the tree line and cutting across the camp toward the fleeing murderer. Holt saw her coming and raised his gun, but Abigail was already upon him, her horse's momentum knocking him to the ground. She heard Owen shouting her name in warning or alarm. She couldn't tell as she wheeled her horse around to face the fallen outlaw. Holt was struggling to his feet, blood staining his side where Owen's bullet had struck him. His face was contorted with rage as he raised his gun toward Abigail. "No." Owen's voice rang out as he raced toward them, his own weapon leveled at Holt. "Drop it, Jasper. It's finished." Something in Owen's tone, a deadly certainty perhaps, or the use of his first name, seemed to penetrate Holt's desperate fury. His eyes darted between Owen and Abigail, calculating his chances. "She's important to you," Holt observed, a malicious smile spreading across his features as he kept his gun trained on Abigail. "I can see it in your eyes, Burke." "This is between you and me," Owen replied, his voice steady despite the fear Abigail could see in his eyes. "Let her go and we'll settle this man to man." Holt's laugh was ugly. "That's not how this works. You've been hunting me for weeks. Now I've got something you want." His finger tightened on the trigger. "Say goodbye to your woman, Burke." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Owen lunged forward with a speed that belied his injuries, placing himself directly between Abigail and Holt's gun. The shot rang out just as Owen tackled Holt to the ground, the bullet going wide. They struggled briefly, a desperate tangle of limbs and fury, before Owen gained the upper hand, pinning Holt with a knee to his chest and his revolver pressed to the outlaw's forehead. "Give me a reason," Owen growled, his voice barely recognizable with rage. "Just one." For a breathless moment, Abigail thought he might pull the trigger, and part of her, the part that had witnessed Holt's callous readiness to kill, wouldn't have blamed him. But then Owen's gaze flickered toward her, and something in his expression shifted. "No," he said, more to himself than to Holt. "That's not justice. That's revenge." With practiced movements, he flipped Holt onto his stomach and bound his hands with a length of rope from his belt. By now, several miners and guards had cautiously returned to the scene, weapons at the ready. Owen pulled a folded paper from his coat, the wanted poster for Jasper Holt, with its promise of $500 for his capture. "This man is wanted for multiple murders," Owen announced, hauling Holt to his feet. "I'm taking him to the authorities in Deadwood. Anyone who interferes will be considered an accomplice." The assembled men exchanged glances, but none seemed inclined to challenge Owen's authority, especially when one of them recognized Holt from the poster and confirmed his identity to the others. With Holt securely bound and mounted on a spare horse, they began the journey back to Broken Ridge, where they would spend the night before continuing to Deadwood the following day. Abigail rode beside Owen, acutely aware of his frequent glances in her direction, part concern, part lingering fear, and something else she couldn't quite identify. It wasn't until they had delivered Holt to the makeshift jail in Broken Ridge and returned to their hotel that Owen finally gave voice to the emotions he'd been holding in check. "You could have been killed," he said as soon as their room door closed behind them, his voice tight with suppressed feeling. "What were you thinking, riding out like that?" "I was thinking he was going to escape," Abigail replied, refusing to be cowed by his anger. "And that you were injured and might not catch him." "That wasn't your decision to make." Owen's control slipped, revealing the fear beneath his anger. "Do you have any idea what it did to me, seeing you ride toward a killer like that? Knowing he could take you from me before I'd even had the chance to." He broke off, turning away as if to collect himself. Abigail moved to him, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "To what, Owen?" When he faced her again, the vulnerability in his eyes took her breath away. "To love you properly," he finished softly. "To show you what you've come to mean to me." The simple honesty of his words melted away any lingering tension between them. Abigail stepped into his embrace, careful of his injuries, but needing the solid reassurance of his arms around her. "I couldn't bear to watch you face him alone," she confessed against his chest. "Not when I had the power to help." Owen's arms tightened around her. "You are the most infuriating, courageous woman I have ever known," he murmured into her hair. "And I am completely, hopelessly in love with you." Abigail looked up at him, her heart full to bursting with emotions she had long denied herself the luxury of feeling. "And I love you, Owen Burke, more than I thought possible." Their kiss was different this time, deeper, more urgent, filled with the knowledge of how easily they might have lost each other. When they finally parted, both breathless and flushed, Owen rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said simply. "Not someday, not eventually. As soon as we reach Deadwood." The unexpected proposal brought happy tears to Abigail's eyes. "Are you certain your life would change completely?" "It already has," Owen replied with quiet certainty. "The moment I saw you standing alone against that mob in Promise Creek. I just didn't realize it yet." "Yes," Abigail whispered, her heart overflowing with joy. "Yes, I will marry you." They journeyed to Deadwood the following day, Holt securely bound and under Owen's watchful eye. The mining boomtown was larger and more established than Broken Ridge, with actual streets, substantial buildings, and a proper sheriff's office. Owen delivered Holt to the authorities with evident relief, collecting the promised bounty after providing his statement and the necessary paperwork. As they left the sheriff's office, $500 richer, Abigail noticed a weight seemed to have lifted from Owen's shoulders. "What now?" she asked as they stood in the bustling main street of Deadwood. Owen's smile was tender as he took her hand in his. "Now we find a preacher and make good on that proposal." They were married that afternoon in the small church at the edge of town, a simple ceremony with only the preacher, his wife, and a couple of curious parishioners as witnesses. Abigail wore her best dress, freshly cleaned and pressed, while Owen had splurged on a new shirt for the occasion. when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife. Owen's kiss held all the promise of their future together, tender yet passionate, a perfect reflection of the man himself. They spent their wedding night in the finest room the Grand Central Hotel had to offer, finally giving full expression to the desire that had been building between them since that stormy night in the Line Shack. Abigail discovered in Owen a gentle yet ardent lover, attentive to her pleasure and moved to speechless wonder by their union. Afterward, as they lay entwined in the moonlight filtering through lace curtains, Abigail traced the scar along Owen's jaw with tender fingers. "What happens tomorrow?" she asked softly. "And all the tomorrows after that." Owen caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "Whatever we want them to be," he replied. "I was thinking we might head to Oregon. I have a friend there who wrote about land for sale, good farmland near a growing town that needs a doctor." Abigail raised herself on one elbow, surprised by how much thought he had already given to their future. "You think I could practice medicine there, without suspicion?" "It's a new place," Owen explained, "growing fast with folks from all walks of life. They care more about what you can do than where you came from." His eyes held hers, filled with conviction. "You have a gift for healing, Abigail. The world needs that, even if some are too ignorant to appreciate it." The faith he had in her abilities brought tears to her eyes. "And what about you? Would you be content as a farmer after the life you've led?" Owen's smile held no regrets. "I've had enough of violence and death to last several lifetimes. The thought of building something instead of hunting men down, of creating a home with you, maybe even a family someday." He shook his head slightly, as if amazed by his own desires. "It sounds like heaven to me." Abigail laid her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Oregon, then," she agreed. "A new start for both of us." In the years that followed, Owen and Abigail Burke would indeed build that life together in Oregon's Willamette Valley. Their farm prospered under Owen's diligent care, while Abigail established herself as a healer whose knowledge of both traditional and indigenous medicine made her services sought after throughout the region. Children came: first a son with Owen's blue eyes and quiet determination, then twin daughters who inherited their mother's healing touch and fierce independence. Their home became known as a place of warmth and welcome, open to travelers and neighbors alike. Occasionally, someone would pass through who recognized Owen from his bounty hunting days or remembered stories of the witch driven from Promise Creek. But in their new community, such past identities held little weight against the reality of who they had become: respected neighbors, loving parents, valued members of society. On summer evenings, Owen and Abigail often sat together on their porch, watching their children play in the golden light of sunset. In those moments, Owen would sometimes think back to that fateful day in Promise Creek, the crowd with stones in their hands, the fear in Abigail's eyes, his own impulsive declaration, "She's mine." He had spoken those words then as a shield, a protection against hatred and ignorance. But over the years, they had transformed into something far more profound: not a claim of possession, but a declaration of belonging, a testament to the love that had saved them both from lives of solitude and given them a home in each other's hearts. "What are you thinking about?" Abigail would ask, noting the distant look in his eyes, and Owen would smile, pulling her close against his side. "Just how lucky I am that I rode into Promise Creek that day." "We both were," Abigail would reply, her head resting on his shoulder as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "We both were."